Welcome, family. Welcome. Welcome to this third edition of the Browder File. I'm your host, Tony Browder. The Browder File is a weekly program featuring history and ancestry, culture, and news you can use. We've got a really special program for you today, a special hour with you today, a program that is near and dear to my heart. We're going to be talking about Brother Listervelt Middleton, who was host of For the People, a program that aired on South Carolina educational television for about 20 years. And Listervelt was a, gosh, how can I describe Listervelt's impact on Washington, D.C.? He was a household name here in the Washington, D.C. community in the late 80s and 90s. And changed the lives of so many people with this program, which aired on Howard's television station. So we're going to be talking about that, taking a trip down memory lane, but also talking about Listervelt's legacy, hearing from a guest who was very close to him. But, you know, what better way to celebrate the man, Listervelt Middleton, than to hear from him himself? And I'm going to play Listervelt reading one of his most famous poems, a poem entitled On the Origin of Things. So, brothers and sisters, it's my honor to introduce to some and reacquaint to others Brother Listervelt Middleton.
Look around you, black child. Your creation is everywhere. Though painted, distorted, given new names, they bear your prints just the same. So sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you know what you see, understand what you hear. You were the first to write, the first to read. Humanity sprang from your black seed. For 110,000 years, you were here alone. And then the Caucasian man was born. Behind the ice, inside the cold, a chill set in this new man's soul. Other minds have been credited with the things they learned from you. Newton, Pythagoras, Kepler, and Galileo too. Sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you'll know what you see, understand what you hear. You made the serpent the symbol of the healing arts, and African justice was goddess Mat, who weighed herself against the African soul, truth and justice blindfold. The George Washington Monument is yours too, a copy of the African Tekenu, the symbol of the black world's powers of creation, the black man's penis in divine procreation. The king of southern Egypt wore the white crown. Keep listening and you catch your mouth when you learn that the central government in Egypt was known as the White House. Sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you know what you see, understand what you hear. Your god Osiris was restored to life long before Buddha, long before Christ. And today, what you call the Madonna and Child is but the first black family worshipped along the Nile. And when you feel the Spirit, the Holy Ghost, you should know it started at Abydos, where God Osiris's body was laid, the Holy Land, where Africans prayed. Minute by minute, hour by hour, as you lose your history, you lose your power. So sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you know what you see, understand what you hear.
Brother Listervelt Middleton, On the Origins of Things. That poem was packed, jam-packed with so much knowledge, so much history, so many historical references that we can do a 4-hour show just unpacking all of the references that he laid out in that very brief 3-minute poem. And it centers around the Nile Valley, the Black Nile. So, it's important to understand the role that Brother Listervelt Middleton played in expanding the minds and the consciousness of people who watched his show on a regular basis. Listervelt hosted For the People at South Carolina Educational Television from 1977 until his passing in 1996. And one particular show that really caught the eyes and ears of the DC community was a 13-part program that aired in 1987, featuring Asa Hilliard. Now, Asa Hilliard and Listervelt were close buddies. They were tight as Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben. And if you can imagine Asa Hilliard laying out for 13 consecutive weeks, 30 minutes a week, a history of the Nile Valley, why the Nile Valley was an indigenous African culture, and explaining in great detail all of the elements of Nile Valley culture and civilization that were innately African. That program just shifted the minds of so many people here in DC. We had the pleasure of hosting a tribute to Brother Listervelt in 1993 when he was suffering from multiple myeloma, and he passed on April the 14th, 1996. And so I am a firm believer in the value of remembering our ancestors and honoring their legacy. And I can't think of a better person to have on my show today than a brother who spent years and probably a couple of decades in brotherhood with Listervelt Middleton. My guest today is Bernie Gallman, and I'm just going to give you some highlights about this brother. He sent me a bio that was 18 pages. A very distinguished brother, but he was born in South Carolina, attended Morehouse College and Benedict College in Columbia. He graduated from medical school and did his residency at DC General right here in the District of Columbia. He retired from private practice after 39 years and now works at the Veterans Medical Center in Columbia. He's a member of numerous organizations and is a thinker, a reader, and someone who has a firm understanding of African history and culture and an immense dedication to African people. He'll talk more about who he is and what he's done, his books. But I want to invite my dear friend Bernie Gallman to the airways of WPFW, to the Browder File. How you doing, Brother Bernie? How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, and I'm honored to be here with you.
Well, thank you, man. We were just talking before the show about the relationship of a group of brothers who met regularly in South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, to study history, to talk about history, to talk about your community. And Listervelt was a central figure within that group. So can you share with our audience what Listervelt meant to this gathering of Black men and what he also meant to your community, not just in Columbia, South Carolina, but in the state itself?
To the world, actually.
All right, expand it on out, brother.
Let me start by going over how I met Listervelt. I was introduced to For the People by a sister who was a mutual friend who transitioned actually a few months ago. Actually, she was an elder in her 90s. Her name was Marjorie Hammock. And she and Listervelt were very, very close. They had been active in some organizations before I actually moved back to Columbia from DC. And she said, you need to watch this show. So I started watching it, and then she said, we have watch parties sometimes at my house. Why don't you come? So I went to her house to watch For the People, and he was there, and And I met him then, and we became friendly, but it was, we didn't fall into a deep friendship. As it turns out, our wives were pregnant, and we went to prenatal uh, training at the same time, and we really became very close then. And at that time, I realized that he lived around the corner from my office at that time. So frequently on Fridays, I would finish up and go by his house before I go home, and he'd fry up some fish and we'd argue. It was almost like we would pick sides to have a debate, but he would always win because he'd get on the phone and call the experts.
Mm.
He called Asa, he called Dr. Clark. And so if I wasn't exactly correct, but that was a lot of fun. That was something
Sure.
that we enjoyed doing. So Listervelt actually in 1987 was the recorder, and he went to Kemet with an organization called the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, ASCAC. He was one of almost 1,000 AUSA. And we call African Americans AUSA, Africans from the United States of America, who went that year. And when he got back, he was impressed because Listervelt had a very close relationship with a group in New York that had been turning me on.
This was the community at First World in
First
Harlem?
World Alliance, yes.
Yes.
Brother Bill and Sister Keffa.
Yes.
And so when he got back, he said,
Well, Bernie, let me stop you for a minute, because I recall during that trip, that ASCAC trip, where almost 1,000 of us came to Egypt. It was the largest contingent of African Americans to travel to Egypt at one time, and shifted the whole travel industry in Egypt for well over a decade. Listervelt brought his camera crew, and he recorded interviews with Dr. Ben and Asa Hilliard and Dr. Clark and Lynn and Roz Jeffries and James Small, Naeem Akbar, and the whole, the best by community. And those interviews aired on successive airings For the People. It was something that we had never seen before, man. So to have these scholars on the Nile in Egypt talk about Nile Valley education, talk about psychiatry in the Nile Valley, medicine in the Nile Valley, education in the Nile Valley was so transformative, man. So there was something special about Listervelt's communication skills that allowed him to take his interest in African history and just engross an audience in learning about who we were, learning about the origins of things and the impacts of the things that our ancestors created on the world, culture around the world.
Yeah, he would he would ask what we used to laughingly call those Listervelt questions. And it's funny because whenever he would ask our friend Charles Finch, Charles can get very didactic. So Listervelt would interrupt him and say, "Break it down, brother, break it down." But Listervelt turned us on to ASCAC, and the brother that I was telling you about, Randy Scott, along with Jerome and I, and Brother Bill, who was the elder in our brotherhood, Bill Gunn, had started a study group already before we even knew about ASCAC. And so Listervelt said, they're having a Southern Region meeting in Miami. Y'all need to go. So Randy and I went, and up until that point, what Listervelt had been doing, Brother Bill had been sending him tapes of lectures from the First World. And Listervelt would listen and give them to me. And I was familiar with a lot of the people before I actually met them. And so Randy and I went down, and we were convinced. We joined ASCAC, and that's when we started our lecture series, and which actually now lives on a yearly basis in Listervelt's name.
Mm-hmm.
We formed a brotherhood. You mentioned that at the top. We formed a brotherhood, 7 of us, that has lived up until this day. And at that point, I can truly say that from 1990 until this very day, there's a group of us that have shared a meal, at least one meal a week together since that time. We would have breakfast on Thursdays when I had more control over my time. And when I went out to the VA and lost control over my time, when meeting the man wasn't me, then we moved it to Saturday. But we have been doing that since that time. And I like to say we solve all the problems of the world, but that forms the nidus of a lot of different activities that each of us is involved in. Bill Gunn, our elder, established an organization that he calls the Kemetic Institute for Health and Human Services. And Bill is also responsible for the yearly Listervelt Middleton lecture series at Benedict College. And Derek is the priest at our Kemetic temple, Christ Universal Temple, and that's spelled KRST.
And what's the significance of that word, Christ?
Well, as I understand it, Christ is the original spelling of that term, and that Christ actually, even though some people don't know it, Christ was a title. It wasn't a name. So the person they called Jesus didn't have a surname named Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant the anointed. And so we were an outgrowth of another organization, but then we stepped out and formed our own. And Derek, Joe Benton, and I created an organization we call Project Sankofa, which is a rites of passage organization. We actually published a book, which is actually in the 2nd edition now, that dealt with our methodology of rites of passage, primarily for boys, but then we brought in women to put a spin on it that would work for young women.
Mm-hmm.
Had been doing that for a number of years.
So let's look at this, man. I'm listening to you talk about all of the organizations and associations that evolved out of your meeting, Listervelt, that evolved out of the watch party for the people. Tell me about the beginnings of For the People. As I understand it, Listervelt was interested in hosting a show that showcased people of African ancestry in South Carolina because we were never shown in a favorable light in the media. So that was the original intent of For the People, to showcase the Black people in the state of South Carolina. Is that correct?
That is correct. And actually, the original planned host was a sister here. I think her name is Beryl Dakers, she's an elder and she's still active at ETV, more on the production side now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure of the circumstances that changed that original plan, but Listervelt, now when Listervelt first came back to South Carolina, he actually was on a radio. There was a Black-owned radio station here, and he was the news director for that. And he had built up quite a following there. And a brother who actually became very, very important to Listervelt because he was Listervelt's producer, Bill Terrell. That name may ring a bell because Bill Terrell had a show called Job Man Caravan, in which he kind of had a hybrid show. It was kind of like a music dance show in which he would highlight people in certain occupations and professions and have them speak to the audience about what it took to get to that point or how to become that.
Mm.
And actually, that was, as I understand it, the first and perhaps the only Emmy that South Carolina Public Television ever won.
Is that right?
I'm not sure. They may have won more since then, but I know that was the first.
Well, you know, if there was justice in the media, For the People should have won multiple Emmys.
Multiple. Well, For the People actually was put on the endangered list quite a few times.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I wanted to get to that because as I understood the evolution of the show, Listervelt started off showcasing just regular people in South Carolina, and things shifted when he interviewed two brilliant sons of South Carolina, Chancellor Williams, who's from Bennettsville, if I'm not mistaken, and John G. Jackson, who's from Macon.
Absolutely.
And those two brothers, the Chancellor Williams, for those in the audience, you should know, but Chancellor Williams was the author of Destruction of Black Civilization, and John Jackson was the author of Introduction to African Civilization and other publications. But having these two scholars on talk about the history of African people in ancient times obviously shifted the whole dynamic of the show. And then Listervelt began to bring in other scholars who were not residents of South Carolina. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
Frequently, he would, whenever he brought scholars in, he would allow people like me, people like our friend Baba Derek, to interact with them. I had the opportunity to go to many of the tapings of the shows.
Yeah, he taped the show before a live studio audience, correct?
Sometimes, not always.
Sometimes. Okay.
Not always, no. Sometimes I would get a chance to interact with them before the show. Sometimes we go out to eat afterwards, and it was interesting because, you know, that's how I met Asa, Van Sertima, Malefi Asante, Marimba Ani, and it was always a very interesting thing because I was a dry sponge trying to soak up all the information. And it was a heady time.
Yeah.
But Listervelt always got in trouble with two particular guests.
And they were?
Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen and Dr. Francis Chris Wilson.
And why, pray tell, did Listervelt get in trouble with those two guests? What could they have said that caused so much consternation for the viewing audience?
Well, I can specifically, after Dr. Wilson was on one time, Listervelt got a call from a person who was obviously non-Black, and who said, "I'm not a white albino mutant." And after that, the president of South Carolina ETV started wondering whether or not it was worth it and everything. So actually, Jerome and I and our study group organized a For the People Day at Benedict, and we had a lot of the local politicians, NAACP leaders and everything. along with James Small, Asa Hilliard, Dr. Clark, who came down to support us. And we wrote a letter. My wife was scared to death because she said, you know, you go bring these folk down on you. I said, well, so be it.
Yeah.
Jerome and I co-signed the letter and wrote a letter saying the community was in favor for the people and don't you touch it. Obviously, we didn't use threatening language, but at the same time, we said in no uncertain term that the community was firmly behind for the people. So the president then, his name was Carthen, I think, actually did nothing to hinder Listervelt after that. And and to his credit, he never did anything explicitly or actively to influence Listervelt one way or the other.
Okay.
And
Now,
I
you
might
know,
add that upon his death, he was very, very helpful to Listervelt's wife, Ernestine.
okay. Well, you know, during those troubled times for Listervelt, we here in DC also took to writing letters of support and calling the station because SCETV is South Carolina Educational Television, right? And that educational component was really expressed through Listervelt's show because here in Washington, D.C., we had never seen a television show like that. Maybe the closest thing to it was Tony Browder's Journal. But Tony was relatively safe, shall I say, and brought in some heavy hitters, but he didn't bring them in on the regular. Listervelt brought in the best of our community. And Howard University had a TV station, and they aired for the people Sundays at 11 a.m. and they repeated Sunday's show that evening at 8 p.m. and then repeated it again on Wednesday at 8 o'clock. So we had a chance to hear and see Listervelt and his guests 3 times a week. So we were immersed in that show, loved the show. So every time there was an issue, we did whatever we could do to support you all in South Carolina, and we staved off the naysayers. And I do recall one instance when Doc Ben was on, and he was talking about the African origins of Christianity, the African origins of Judaism, and buddy, did that rub some people the wrong way? And there was another call to pull the show. And we had to marshal the forces again to come to Listerville support. So that whole exchange, man, was so telling because, you know, we saw that here was a man who was bringing people who were strangers to our community, to the airways, and using the most powerful form of communication at that time, television, to educate the masses. And if I'm not mistaken, For the People originated in Columbia, South Carolina. It aired in Washington, D.C. It also aired in New York City, and I believe there was a station in Tennessee. It may have been Memphis that aired the show, and so it was on rotation in 4 cities. But people would videotape each show and then send those videotapes all throughout the country. So within a matter of years, everybody in the country knew of Legacy of Middleton and were beginning to become aware of these brilliant guests that he had on the show on a regular basis. So, you know, as Listervelt formed this community of African-centered scholars, how did that affect you personally in your chosen profession as a physician? How did that impact you personally?
Derek laughs at me because in my quest for knowledge, because I needed to have some ammunition to be able to argue with him.
Oh, let me put a pin in your response for 1 second. I want to let our listeners know that it's 5:30, the bottom of the hour. You're listening to WPFW. This is Tony Browder, host of the Browder File, and we're talking this evening with Dr. Bernie Gallman, or Brother Kojo, and he's telling us about the life and the legacy of our dear friend, our dear brother, Legacy of Middleton. So continue, my friend.
In my quest for knowledge, one of the things that I used to do was I would go to the University of South Carolina library, the university library, and they had back issues of Black Books Bulletin, Black World, the Negro History Digest, the Journal of Negro History, all the way back from the early 1900s. And I would photocopy articles. And we had a hookup for copying at that time. So I would make, I put together probably a binder of about maybe 30, 35 articles, and we would bind them together. And I'd just make those 25 at a time. And in my office, if somebody was having problems other than purely physical, I say, here, sister, you read this, tell me what you think. I give them that. So that was one of the ways I was, in fact, Listervelt sometimes used to call me the librarian for the Nome of Columbia.
Okay. All right.
Because I would hand out so much. But the other thing about For the People, you know, that a lot of people didn't realize, Listervelt was a perfectionist. And there were many interviews, people that he would pay, you know, to come down, and he'd interview them, and he'd, you know, pay their expenses. And he never aired because he wasn't satisfied with the interview.
Sure.
And I can remember several of those, actually. I remember one in particular, I'm not going to call any names, but after the interview, and we stood out talking, and then he got in his car and he left. And Listervelt looked at me and said, "That dude crazy."
And you don't know until you interview him, right? You know, the book
The guy had written a book that was interesting. But you know, this guy was interesting.
A little off the mark. And you know, it's so important is I'm glad to hear you say that, because, you know, as you were describing making copies of these magazines, you know, we're talking about a time before the internet, right? Where we had to go to libraries. We had to use copy machines to circulate information. We couldn't do a PDF. There was no such thing as a PDF, right? We couldn't email material. So you use your office as a library to disseminate information that would help heal the minds of some of your patients. And you know, that reminded me of something that Dr. Welsing said in, was it 93, when we had the tribute for Listervelt. She shared with the audience that she was addicted to Listervelt Middleton. She watched his shows religiously, and she prescribed watching the show for her patients, particularly patients who were recovering from drug abuse or alcohol addiction, because their addiction was related to some form of low self-esteem. And she would prescribe for her patients to watch For the People, and documented how hearing scholars talk about African people and African history and culture in a favorable light affected the way they saw themselves and helped them heal mentally and emotionally and be able to free themselves from destructive behavior. And, you know, there were many people, many detractors of For the People and African-centered scholarship, who said that all of this history and the lectures were all designed just to make people feel good. So can you speak to this? Can you speak to, as a medical professional who deals with the body and also has some expertise dealing with the mind, how important is it to internalize information that makes you feel good? There's a saying that you are what you eat, and if you eat junk food, you'll have a junky metabolism. I would also suggest that if you read junk history, you will have a negative mental attitude. And conversely, if you read positive and life-affirming stories of historical accomplishments, you would feel better about yourself. Do you think there's any truth to this scenario?
No question, no question. As a matter of fact, when I've had the opportunity to get in discussions with folk who call African-centered history feel-good history, I would say that the history that we've been force-fed is feel-good for Europeans, because Europeans have hidden our history, they've ignored our history, they've distorted our history, and they've even claimed our history. And so why would they do that if it wasn't something about our history that was very positive? And one of the things that I'm looking at now is, and I'm not as well versed on it yet, but there are aspects of our lives that are shortening our lives. We
So
can
just what, give me some examples.
be literally hated to death. The end of DNA, a telomere, for instance,
Yes.
which is kind of like the little thing on the end of a shoelace.
The cap on the shoelace that keeps everything together.
Negative emotions, depression, poor self-esteem can shorten that telomere. And by shortening the telomere, you're not only shortening your life, but you're also exposing yourself to more illness. And this is something I'm actually in the middle of trying to learn more about it, because I want to write about it.
Okay. But so along that same line, as you're talking about telomeres, share with our audience your understanding of epigenetics and how diminished telomeres will result in poor genes that are then expressed in your offspring, subsequent offspring.
Well, eugenics was a pseudoscience that was that actually we can do a whole discussion on that, because eugenics is the basis of a lot of what's going on now.
Yes.
But basically that nature over nurture, or nurture over nature. And but what we find out is that nurture can also affect generationally. And interestingly enough, the study of epigenetics, as I understand it, began when it was noticed that the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors experience a higher rate of mental illness and depression than the general population. And so I have not read anything on epigenetics in the last, I guess, 6 months or so. But up until that point, they were making, the last I heard, there were 2 mechanisms, and I don't remember the details on how the DNA could be affected by your experience. And could be passed on to your children.
Sure. Well, I remember on that point, sorry to interrupt you, but I remember on that point, Patricia Newton, who was a psychiatrist here in Baltimore, colleague of Dr. Welsing, and I believe she may have been a guest on Listervelt's show. She had a saying as a psychiatrist that she talked about how the Ma'afa, the transatlantic enslavement, the European enslavement of African people changed us. And she had a statement where she said that the Africans who got on the slave ship were different than the Africans who got off the slave ship. That traumatic experience, because of epigenetics, changed the genetic makeup of everyone who survived and affected them on multiple levels. And those changed DNA strands were passed down to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And so we're still dealing with the lingering effects of post-traumatic slavery disorder.
Now, theoretically, if a generation is able to make itself positive, to clear up all those things and to raise your offspring in a positive environment, theoretically, over generations, you can improve that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know whether I remember to send you, but if we go back to Sheikh Anta Diop's To Cradle Theory,
Yes, yes.
and we look at the way that the environment affected
Mm-hmm.
the Africans who were trapped in Europe during the last ice age, the WRM interglacial.
Mm-hmm.
And as Dr. Diop said, I mean, we know that environment over thousands of years can affect the way you look.
Exactly.
So the fact that they lost color can be explained using DNA, calcium metabolism, ultraviolet lights, and all of that. The fact that the lips inverted, the fact that the nasal index decreased, the fact that the hair became less tightly curled can be explained.
Yes. Scientifically explained.
Scientifically. But what Dr. Diop said is that their outlook changed.
Mm-hmm.
Their way of seeing things, their culture changed, and they became much more, because they had to be more aggressive in order to survive, they became more aggressive. They became more materialistic because it was hard to hold on to things. They became misogynistic because since women were physically weaker, men saw them as a drag. So what we're seeing now, Dr. Jeffries got lambasted for saying, talking about the people of the ice.
Mm-hmm.
It can be explained, and
absolutely.
I would challenge anyone to say that it's wrong.
Sure. And what's interesting when I think about all the incredible shows that Listervelt hosted throughout his 20-year tenure for the people, I recall when he aired the interview with Sheikh Anta Diop. Oh, yeah. It was, brother, it was so life transforming on so many levels to see. Now we had heard, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was Dr. Clark, Jeffries, and Van Sertima who were responsible for introducing Van Sertima to our larger community. I mean, excuse me, Jacques to our larger community. And we had heard about his works, and some of us even read his works, but to be able to sit down and watch him explain these concepts with the Listervelt. Now, he had to do it through an interpreter, man, but that was truly a must-see TV, man. And people are still talking about those shows.
Listervelt was over the moon about that. And he was laughing because there was a point, if you remember the interview, and I'm sure
absolutely,
the young lady who was doing the translated incorrectly, and Dr. Diop corrected her.
Yes.
And the fact is that he did speak English, but he was not confident in his English.
Right.
But he corrected her.
Got another classic For the People episode was when he did a live show with Martin Bernal, the author of Black Athena. That was another classic. And Bernal was one of the rare white scholars who actually co-signed what the African scholars have been saying for decades and even centuries. That was a special show as well. And you know, I think in terms of, man, it's hard to really express how transformative these shows were. And if we can, you know, talk briefly, and we only have about 7 more minutes left, I want to shift and talk a little bit about Listervelt's battle with cancer and how the community rallied around this soldier and helped lift him up and lift his family up during his last few years of life.
Yeah, briefly, let me just say about Bernal.
Mm-hmm.
Listervelt had a reception at his house after that interview.
Okay.
And Bernal managed to piss off a lot of people.
Is that right? What did he do?
Yeah.
What did he say? He contradicted some of the things or tried to backpedal?
No, not exactly, but it was just that he was not as nailed in as his words in the book would have seemed.
Okay.
Yeah. But Listervelt actually had been having back pain for a long time. And he had been going to a chiropractor. And they had done x-rays and they were doing what they do and it wasn't getting any better. And he talked to me and he came to see my partner, who was also very African-centered, Dr. Ron Johnson, who is actually from Croom, Maryland, which is right above Upper Marlboro.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And he came to see Ron, and Ron diagnosed his multiple myeloma and got him started in, you know, referred him to another brother who was an oncologist by the name of Rudy Wise. And they started the treatment, which was a real roller coaster.
Sure.
You know, we would visit Listervelt very frequently. He was in and out of the hospital. And Tony, when you pulled together that benefit to try to raise money for him,
we didn't try to raise money. We
yeah, well, we said that we were gonna do the same thing.
Okay.
So we did the same thing. We didn't raise quite as much money as you did, but we were able to put some money in their hand.
Yeah.
It was interesting because after it was over, I think I had to do something, and was it Derek or one of the other brothers took the money to Ernestine, because Listervelt was in the hospital at that time.
Okay.
And I took it in a paper bag. But it was very gratifying because a lot of the scholars who came to DC also came to Columbia.
Yeah. If I can just talk about that event, seeing the community, a national community come together to honor one of our heroes. We had sponsored our tribute at Howard University, Crampton Auditorium. And I think Crampton holds about 1,300 people. We had over 1,000 people in attendance for 2 days, the 23rd and 24th of January, 1993. And I believe we had over 20 scholars who had appeared on For the People come at their own expense to give many presentations, on average 15, 20-minute presentations about whatever their subject matter was, and also to honor Listervelt. And he and his wife and family, his wife, Ernestine, was from Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken. They sat, you know, in the front row, and man, to just see the look on his face and to watch him feel the love from all the scholars and all the people in the audience who came there to honor this man was truly life transforming for me. And I recall on the last day, Dr. Welsing's sister, Lauren Crest Love, who is one of the general managers for WPFW. She came up on stage and went into church mode and started, raising money. We raised over $40,000, brother.
Yeah.
Took up this collection to help this man and his family defray his medical expenses. And it was one of the best examples I've ever witnessed of a community coming together to honor one of their own. And we didn't have to beg anybody for permission. We did it ourselves. And it made me so proud of what this work does to instill in the people a sense of power, a sense of responsibility. And, we certainly need that spirit again. Now Listervelt passed on April the 14th, 1996. And you all have been working in South Carolina to keep his legacy going. What are some of the things that you're doing now to keep Brother Listervelt's spirit alive?
Aside from the lecture series, we have been in contact with South Carolina ETV. For some reason, the shows were not available. They were available for a while on the website, and then we were given the reason that they weren't available because the media was outdated and they couldn't do anything. So I made some contact with some folk and mentioned that there were very, very concerned and interested people all over the country. Mm-hmm. So I was told that they have made selected shows available that could for order that on DVD if someone would like to order some of the shows. So that's that, and we're in the process of trying to see what the next step is going to be.
Okay, but they're also for people who haven't seen the programs and are interested in watching them. There are dozens of bootleg tapes on YouTube right now. So I would encourage everyone to check out Brother Listervelt and take a journey back through time and free your mind by exposing yourself to life transforming information. Well, Brother Bernie, we've come to the end of this hour, and I want to thank you so much for being my third guest on the Browder File. Would you have any parting words you want to leave with our listeners, or maybe provide, if you have a website for South Carolina Educational Television or any other information you want to leave to our listeners, please do so now.
Well, I would urge everyone to get over their fear of history, because history can build group solidarity. And that group solidarity can help us to move forward. And we're going to need that in the coming 7 years, because it's the grounds for our resistance. Absolutely. So For the People is a great start. If I could toot my horn, the book that I wrote, Sankofa University, has a chapter dedicated to a list of scholars who, at that time, I recommended that people read. And books.
All right. Before we go, because the clock is ticking, can you give a website where people can reach you to order your books or get more information about what you're doing?
www.imhotepthedrum.com. That's IMHOTEPTHEDRUM.com.
All right. Well, Brother Kojo, Dr. Bernie Gallman, thank you so much for being my guest. Thank you so much for lifting up the memory, the legacy of our dear brother Listervelt Middleton. And this is Tony Browder. I also want to congratulate Paul Coates. In closing, I want to congratulate Paul Coates, who is being honored tonight at the 75th National Book Awards in New York City. Paul Coates will be our guest next Wednesday on November the 27th. And then on December the 4th, we'll have Wayne Chandler, who'll be coming. Yes, sir. Wayne Chandler will be our guest. He'll be coming to DC on the 7th of December. So up next is Margaret Kimberly with Black Agenda Report. And this is Tony Browder, reminding you that, your world is what you make it. And what you internalize, what you see, what you read, what you listen to affects you on a cellular level. And so it's important. We live in a world that has gotten so ugly lately. It's important for us to be engaged in the process in unearthing the beauty within us, and the beauty and the light and the power in the world around us. And as Maurice White of Earth, Wind, and Fire always says, if there ain't no beauty, you got to make some beauty. And it's something that we all have the capacity to do. So never give up that power to anyone. It's within you. It has to be amplified and used for the betterment of yourself, your family, and your community. So this is the third Wednesday of the month. This is Wisdom Wednesday at IKG. And so I want you all to stay tuned in for additional opportunities to empower yourself with the knowledge of self, with history and ancestry and good conversation that will help you see yourself and help you see the world through new and better eyes. So I'll be talking to you all next Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. We'll be having Paul Coates, and he'll be talking about him receiving this honor from the National Book Awards. And also he'll be sharing some information about his work. Now, he's being honored because of his work as publisher of Black Classic Press. They've been in existence for 52 years, putting in circulation, back in circulation, books written by some of the guests who appeared on Listervelt Middleton's show For the People. We're fighting for our lives, folks. We're fighting for our historical and cultural memory. And it's important that we acknowledge and honor those sisters and brothers who are in the forefront of this fight. It's a fight that I know we will be victorious, not just because of what we've done, what our ancestors have done, but because of what we have the capacity to do. And it's knowing who you are. It's building on that knowledge that you have the opportunity to create something that will be passed down to your descendants, something that you will inherit, and something that can transform the world. So this is Tony Browder. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Browder File. Peace, everybody. Good night. All right, that's it.
Hey,
Short and sweet. Thank you, brother.
I enjoyed that, man. Thank you.
Well, good. You're welcome. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm getting my schedule together for 2025. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is to have some regular guests that I know have good information. And I want to discuss different books. So maybe we can talk about having you back to discuss maybe one of your favorite books and to share information that you think people can benefit from. So I'll be getting
you.
Pardon me?
Anytime for you.
Oh, well, thank you, man. And tell Brother Derek that I'll be reaching out to him. I'm going to have him on the show next month. And I want to focus specifically on preparing for the winter solstice, preparing for the holiday, Christmas and Kwanzaa season, and what that means for African people from a cultural and spiritual perspective, man. So we're going to do our best to keep the spirit of Listervelt and all of our other great ancestors alive.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, man.
All right. You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.
Stop recording.